official history of the diocese is A.P. Elkin. Elkin was a professor of anthropology at Sydney University and a friend of the Bishop Batty, and he was asked to write this and he did. It is exceedingly thorough, exceedingly heavy. The book itself is on quality paper, it weighs a ton, and exceedingly boring. I, as a historian, found it fascinating, but it's not light reading. Elkin, however, possibly at the request of the bishop, steered clear of all controversy. So he doesn't even mention churchmanship most of the time. He says Newcastle was devoid of the kind of sectarian issues that other dioceses had. There's a book by Paul Robertson which says all that's bunk. Proclaiming unsearchable riches, the Newcastle and minority evangelical Anglican 1788 to 1900. Paul has, and I'll mention a couple of things from his book, but basically I'm going to sort of skip over it. He's also looked at evangelicals in the 20th century. He gave a lecture on that, which I didn't get to go to, unfortunately, but he did kindly send me his notes. But I want to leave that sort of stuff out. I want to be gentle, all right, till we get to the end. And indeed, I want to tell you that the initial history, the initial bishop, William Tyrrell, has become one of my heroes. And you'll probably understand why when we go into what he did. But look, evangelicals, there's always been a minority of evangelicals. Some of them have been cooperating, some non-cooperating. Some have been removed. But evangelicals have always played a significant role in the diocese, usually contributing well above their numerical position, and attacks on them have ebbed and flowed. The bulk of Newcastle bishops have been moderates. In other words, they're happy to work with anybody who do the job. And it's only in recent years that there's been a different attitude. Now, you need to, as a background, understand a little bit of the geography, and it's quite important. The east coast of Australia has the Great Dividing Range, which we call mountains, which the Swiss look at and say, it's a hill. But the Great Dividing Range in many places is very, very hard to cross. And you know the trouble I had going from Sydney up to Lithgow. The range comes out around the Hunter Valley. And that's really basically the Hunter Valley. Down here, you have the Hawkesbury River, which created a major barrier for transport. So all early transport was either by boat, the 60 miles, because it was 60 miles from Newcastle to Sydney by boat. The coal ships and so on did that. Or by road from coming out to Windsor, coming around the Great North Road, which brought you in often up at Singleton. When you got to there, you would then come down to Newcastle. Newcastle itself, initially, the harbour foreshores were shallow and muddy. And so the port for the Hunter Valley was Morpeth. And indeed, if you went up the Patterson River up here, to Patterson itself, Patterson was a major town. In Patterson, they built the biggest ship built in Australia in the 19th century. Now, if you go up there today, the foundation of the shipbuilding yards is still there, just the foundation. You can't see the river. You've actually got to go and look down, and there's a creek down the bottom where they launched the biggest ship built. So Morpeth was the port for the first 50 years. The problem was that the region was rich in timber, And the timber getters, being lazy people, simply took the timber from the riverbanks and floated it down the river. So Morpeth was really the centre of everything at the beginning. Newcastle was unimportant. And when the bishop comes, Newcastle has become the new centre, but Morpeth remains the centre for reasons that I'll talk about. It was called Coal River, and it was called Mulabinba. It was discovered by Lieutenant John Shortland in 1797. He had been sent north to try to catch some convicts who were headed for China. He didn't catch them. They've never been found. I have serious doubts they got to China, but they thought China was just over the Hawkesbury River. He said it was a very fine coal river, and he named it after Governor John Hunter. If you go up by boat, you can still see coal seams at Red Head and closer in at Prince Edward Park and so on. That's what he saw, coal seams that were there. And the colony's first export was coal. You know, in the old primary school days, they taught you all about wool, but in fact, we made money from coal before we made money from wool. And in 1816 to 1818, the streets were laid out. Now, in 1801, it was changed from Coal River to Kingstown, and it was designed to produce coal and timber, but it only lasted a year before it failed. And so in 1804, it was turned into a penal colony, and it succeeded because you got the very worst convicts to go and dig coal. That's fair enough, isn't it? Put them to work. Many coal miners came from Newcastle in the United Kingdom to work in the Hunter Valley, and that became a big tradition, and that's why so many towns are named after Newcastle in the UK. 1816 to 1818, the streets of the town were laid out. I don't know if you've driven in Newcastle, they didn't do a very good job, I've got to tell you, but anyway. The first church was built on the site of the present cathedral. There's an old drawing. It was built in 1818, but that's from the 1820s. You can see the hill is quite significant. You see the town set out below, and you can see Nobby's without the breakwater. The breakwater was started but hadn't got very far. It was a big task to build it. But it's that, and then the further breakwaters that have made Newcastle Harbour possible to use. So, in 1818, okay, the first church was built. They built a jail, began work on the breakwater, and the first school was built. In 1822, prisoners were sent to Port Macquarie, and Newcastle was opened up to free settlers for farming, and that changed the nature of the place. Just very briefly, there was a congregational minister, Reverend Lance Threlkeld, who worked in the early years amongst the Aborigines. Had a mission station up, probably around the entrance to Lake Macquarie at Swansea. It wasn't successful, but he not only worked with them, he worked amongst ship mariners and the poor. He did translate portions of the New Testament into some Aboriginal languages. But I just throw that in because it is important. Now, the Australian Agricultural Company was very important. Today it is one of Australia's oldest companies. Its headquarters in Brisbane. It still owns 2.7 million hectares of farms in Queensland and the Northern Territory, and 24 cattle stations, and 2 feedlots. However, it was very important in the early days. It was founded in 1824 by an act of the British Parliament. It was designed to protect the land grants to wealthy individuals, to use and to actually give them a source of sending their stuff off, to use cheap convict labour. It had 4,000 400 British investors, and it was given a grant of 405,000 hectares, which is about 1 million acres, stretching from the Kirkaldy River up to Gloucester. And then later it got land at Murrurundi and then at Tamworth. It exploited the settlers where land grants were given. It certainly exploited the convicts. It was not a particularly ethical company in its early days. That did change. It was given land in Newcastle then, where it was given a 30-year monopoly on coal. And all that land they kept until the 1920s when they moved out of coal. But they had a 30-year monopoly, which led to a lot of lawsuits because lots of coal mines opened that were illegal. In 1831, Albert, this is for you, they opened Australia's first railway. It was an incline rail from the pit to the wharf. The loaded wagons came down and pulled up the empties. However, they were important for 4 things. They're important, first of all, for population. Because of their business, they were able to bring lots of people to the area to work. So part of the development of the area came from that. They developed towns for those people to live in, and those towns later become centres for churches. The biggest thing was they built roads. Remember when we did New Testament or early church history, I said that the Roman roads enabled Paul to spread the gospel much more easily throughout the ancient world. Well, the Australian Agricultural Company's roads enabled the church to advance quite well. And of course they brought prosperity to the region because of what they did. 3 main towns were Stroud, Carrington and Hamilton. Sir William Parry was the chairman of the company at that stage. He was an evangelical. Robertson spent some time on him. He built the church in Stroud, which is the top one. Couldn't find a minister for it, so a Congregationalist minister was in charge until 1836 when William Cowper became rector, the son of William Cowper from last week. Now, there was controversy because the Congregational minister didn't believe in godparents, and so he insisted that parents stand in the role of godparents. And there was a lot of to and fro. In the end, Broughton, the Bishop of Australia, gave in and allowed it to happen reluctantly. Carrington was the original site. Now, it's not Carrington in Newcastle, it's Carrington in Port Stephens. It was the original site of the company's headquarters because it's on the water. Not a particularly good port, but it was good enough for what they wanted. And in 1847, they built, Stroud was 1833, I think. 1837, they built that church at Carrington, which sadly is now not used. It's still in reasonable condition. It was used as a wedding venue for a while. The church did sell it, and anyway, neither of those churches could be consecrated because they were owned by the Australian Agricultural Company. It wasn't until the 1850s that they gave them to the diocese, and when they gave them to the diocese, they could be consecrated. And Hamilton, which was a suburb of Newcastle, originally called Garden Suburb, Pitt Town, Ball Hole, Happy Flat, and then Hamilton. And they operated mines there, and they owned most of the land, although there was no church. The church that currently exists wasn't built until 1885. All right, before the creation of the diocese, the first chaplain was George Middleton. First chaplain was George Middleton in 1821. Prior to that, clergy had visited Samuel Marston, Henry Fulton, William Cowper, their senior, Robert Cartwright, John Ewell. The first church was built It was a slab building, and the tower didn't last all that long. It was actually unstable and was pulled down, but there are two views of it. Quite a simple church. It was built in 1818, and it remained right through the first bishop, who refused to do anything to it. The church was led by the laity. The first clergyman to take a service there was William Cowper. So the first church service by a clergyman at the cathedral in Newcastle was by an evangelical, and a very famous evangelical on that. The first permanent clergyman was George Middleton. His parish was the whole Hunter Valley, which is not bad. We'll talk about distances in a minute. He's probably most famous for the fact that he discovered, along with another person, an Aboriginal route from Sydney to Newcastle via Wollongong. And they marked it out carefully, and it was actually called the Parsons Road after him. In 1827, so after 6 years, he purchased 2,000 acres of land near Paterson. He was given glebe land to support him, which he lost when he resigned, but he purchased 2,000 acres. So in 1828, when he was asked to go to Port Macquarie, guess what? He said to the bishop, "Nah, I ain't leaving my land," and he resigned. Certain commitment questions there. But he did spend a lot of time unofficially supporting the second clergyman, the Reverend Frederick Wilkinson. Wilkinson only lasted 2 years. He was suspended as a troublemaker. Now, Elkin doesn't mention what the trouble is, and he wasn't a troublemaker as an evangelical, because Robertson doesn't say much about him either. So what his trouble was, I have no idea. He was replaced by the Reverend Charles Wilson, who for 3 years was rector of the Hunter Valley and visited every centre in the Hunter Valley once every 3 months. Now, that's incredible travel. Again, I'll come to distances in a minute. It was subdivided in 1834 when the Reverend George Rusden was appointed to Maitland, and then in the next 10 years 8 more chaplains were appointed. So there's fairly quick growth. The growth was simple, 846 in 1819 down to 30,000, and that's rapid growth and very, very hard for the church to keep up with. The biggest reason, the biggest issue, of course, was that the church spread beyond the Hunter Valley. The government tried to control settlement, and so they had 7 counties and then 17 counties and 19 counties, and it was illegal to develop land outside of those. Well, what happened, of course, in this period was the squatters went out and simply took land outside of the counties. In the 1880s, from memory, they were actually, those who were still there were given the land free by the government. Number of problems the church faced: there was rapid population growth and a big spread of the population, so it was very hard to keep up. Building churches, getting clergy, all that sort of thing. There was poor organisation because Broughton, William Grant Broughton, was the Archdeacon of Australia, and then in 1835 the Bishop of Australia. So he was the Bishop of the whole of Australia. In 1842, from memory, Tasmania was separated and got its own bishop. But until 1847 he had the lot, and obviously he couldn't do much. Probably the biggest problem, however, for the church was poor morality. You had a convict base, and they were the dregs of English society, although weren't always as bad as some of the modern books paint them to be. There was a lack of education and instruction. They came out without education, and there wasn't much education. The only education in Australia was the education that the church provided. And the big thing about the early clergy is they were really good on education. It wasn't what they were there for. Richard Johnson, the first chaplain, started the first school, found convicts who were educated, taught them how to be school teachers, and then ran the rules for the school and everything else. And we'll talk more about that later on. Free settlers were not much better because, you see, they were like anybody who leaves home and is a long way away from home. Suddenly they stop going to church and they start doing all sorts of things they wouldn't do at home where they were known. And so the free settlers often didn't sort of help very much. The New South Wales Corps, which was the police force, was corrupt. Alcohol was a problem, especially rum, and you'll remember because of the alcohol problem, Governor Bligh tried to do something about it. The New South Wales Corps then revolted, and you had the rum rebellion. And he went back to a little disgrace. And of course, morality is not helped when there are 4 males to every female in Sydney. Amongst the convicts, there are 28 males to every female. And if you left Sydney and went to the outer areas, 152 miles to every female. That created some problems. Now until 1835 there were no ordinations and no confirmations because there's no bishop. And that's the problem with the Anglican system. There's no bishop, you can't have anything. It was the Bishop of Calcutta who was responsible, and he, of course, never came here. There was no local training. If you wanted to be a minister, as William Cowper did, you had to go to England to train. And if you went to England to train, apart from it being expensive, you often didn't come back. You know, it's the modern situation where Asian students come here to go to university and never go back. That's the way it works. When I was at university, it was the Colombo scheme. People from what's now Sri Lanka were out, and most of those never went back. It was a wonderful idea. You bring them to Australia, the government paid for it, bring them to Australia, train them, and send them back to their country as educated people, but most of them decided not to go back. And the other problem, which is that there was, it is a lack of money. Now, the Church Act I talked about last week, where if you raised money to build a church and a school and to employ a clergyman, the government paid as much as you'd raised, so it was half and half. And that was a major source of income, of course, but only for a short time, because, as I mentioned last week, when you had a small town, and the Anglicans built a church, and the Catholics built a church, and the Presbyterians built a church, and the Methodists built a church, and the Baptists built a church, the government went broke. So that didn't last very long. But the government was very good about it. They said any clergy stipends that are being paid under the Church Act will continue to be paid to that clergyman until he retires or resigns. And so it's not until the 1880s that it really hits. There are none of those left. The other thing is the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge were 2 English societies that gave a lot of money for the church. So a new diocese was created in 1847, the Diocese of Newcastle. It was everything north of the Hawkesbury River. Right. Up north to Cape York and westwards, well, wherever there was settlement. There were no boundaries at that stage. The diocese covered 125,000 square miles, which is 320,000 square kilometres. Now, do you want to put that into perspective? England, Scotland and Wales are 80,000 square miles and 209,000 square kilometres. So imagine what happens when the first bishop is appointed and he comes out to an area bigger than England, Scotland and Wales, when he had been rector of a small rural parish. Incredible task. There were 14 clergymen and 18 parishes in that whole area. Very, very sparse. In 1849, the parishes, and on the back of your handout, there are two diagrams, two charts. The top one, the parishes that existed when the first bishop arrived. Newcastle, Stroud, East Maitland, West Maitland, then Hinton, which is Morpeth, Scone, Singleton, Patterson, Muswellbrook, Jerry's Plains, Roman Terrace. And then you've got Lower Hawkesbury, Brisbane Water, which is Gosford, and then Port Macquarie, Grafton, Brisbane and Armidale. There were three bishops had to be appointed. The government in 1847 had three new dioceses, Newcastle, Melbourne and Adelaide. If you read Elkin, he doesn't tell you anything about the process of electing the bishop. Robertson has a shot at him over that. He says either he didn't know where the grey papers were or he ignored them. Probably the latter is what he suggested. Grey was a civil servant responsible for the colonies, and he was the one who had the task of putting everything together. And basically what happened was this: he had to keep the different parties within the church happy, because there was strong sectarianism in England at the time. So Perry, on the left, was appointed to Melbourne. He was an evangelical. Short, in the middle, was appointed to Adelaide. He was a high churchman. He was actually offered, he was told you could have a choice of Newcastle or Adelaide, and he chose Adelaide. The man was intelligent.
Yeah.
And so you needed a moderate in the middle to keep everybody happy, and so William Tyrrell was offered Newcastle. I talked last week about how Governor Phillip had nothing to commend him as governor, but he was brilliant. Richard Johnson had nothing to commend him as the first clergyman, but he was brilliant. William Tyrrell didn't have much to commend him either, but he is amazing. He studied at Cambridge University, studied mathematics actually, mathematics, theology and law. He was a friend of George Selwyn, who was a bishop, appointed Bishop of New Zealand, who invited him to go to New Zealand with him as his archdeacon. He turned that down. He spent 6 years as a curate and then became rector of a parish in Hampshire. So he only had one church as a rector. Given what I just told you, the parish was 28 miles in circumference. That is, if you rode around the edge of the parish, it was 28 miles, which is the distance between Newcastle and Morpeth, when you forget the rest. It had 1,000 people. And he came out here to look at a diocese that covered all of the northern part of Australia. He had four immediate problems. He had finance. He had to get money. He set up a group in England, the Newcastle Committee, made up of friends, and then everybody they could rope in, some of them quite influential, whose task was to support the new diocese. They did an excellent job raising money, and they also looked out for clergymen for him. What they raised was nowhere near enough, but at least it gave him something. Clergy, he brought 3 clergy with him and 7 candidates for ministry. Now, the candidates for ministry, the idea was he would train them. They would be his apprentices. So 7 came out, 4 were ordained a year later. 1 was deemed unsuitable and told to go home, and 2 died within 5 months of arrival. He also brought out 1 schoolmaster and 1 schoolmistress, which didn't go very far for the old diocese, but never mind. He had to pack He had to bring his library, which was quite substantial, and a couple of pieces of furniture, which is all he owned. And he brought his staff with him. He brought his housekeeper and gardener. It's important, her name's important because she was his housekeeper for all of his time in Newcastle until he died. He brought his gardener, with the gardener's wife and children. Now, not that he liked flowers, you had to grow your own vegetables, and if you're the bishop and you're travelling around, you can't. So he's got a gardener to do that. Very important. And then the most important staff member of all is groom, because he had to have decent horses. That was the basis of his ministry. And so the groom came out with him. His attitude, I love it. To wear out is better than to rust out. And let me tell you, he never stopped still long enough to rust, and after 31 years he really did wear out. He was an absolute mess at the end. He had a routine, interesting routine, of reading, of studying and of writing. And when he travelled, he might actually ride 50 miles in a day, stopping off at stations along the way. And when he got to where he got to at the end of the day, he would spend 3 hours reading and either studying or writing. Now, I am in awe of him. I mean, when we're in Albury, we'd spend maybe 5 hours travelling around. John Knight did all the driving. I just sat and looked at the scenery. And then when we got back, the intention was to write those lectures. I just thought, no, I can't be bothered. I just sit and watch television. And so I'm reading, I'm thinking, I'm sitting there relaxing and thinking I better do something, and I read, that's what this guy did. Incredible. He disliked controversy. He was a moderate churchman, able to work with all forms of churchmanship. He did not like extremists. So if you're a wild Tractarian or a wild evangelical, you got the boot. But basically, all he was interested in was the quality of your work. If you did the job properly, and that's true of most of the Newcastle bishops until recently, till the last 50 years. He set himself up at Morpeth. Lieutenant E.C. Close owned all of Morpeth and built a house. He was a rich man. He was involved in shipbuilding and other things. He built Closebourne House, which he gave to the bishop. It became Bishop's Court. He gave the land around it, including the land for the church, which he built on the half and half system. He provided half the money, the government provided the rest. So he left it all to the church. We frittered it away. It's now a nursing home and so on. It's a great pity because it was a very significant thing. Morpeth was, as I said, was the centre of the valley, and it was the centre of his ministry, he said, so that's why he went there. It had a Wesleyan chapel, a ladies' school, 2-day schools, 5 inns, got these things right, and nearby Hinton had a Presbyterian church and a Baptist church. Hinton is almost nothing now, but those churches were quite substantial. My great-grandfather was married in the Hinton Presbyterian church, and it was quite a significant church in the day. Not there anymore. Had a population of 635, 334 males and 301 females, which is quite reasonable. And originally was served by a clergyman from East Maitland until the church was built, and then it got its own clergyman. And there was regular water transport from Newcastle, which was 27 miles. On one occasion, however, Tyrrell arrived in Newcastle by boat just after the steamer for Morpeth had left. So he walked home. Yeah. Nothing to it. I'm sorry, I'm just in awe of this man. He's become one of my heroes. Before, the problems, money, yep, okay. The Newcastle Committee in England provided money. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge provided money. The government provided money. And then locals were asked to provide money. Now, in England, people didn't give to the church. In fact, the basic thing in England was on Easter Sunday you gave money to the rector. That was basically a stipend. The Lord of the Manor supported the church. And it was very, very difficult for people to get the idea you had to give. The local landowners, who were the lords of the manor, couldn't give because Australia's different to England. In Australia you have 4 distinct seasons. You have trade problems. You know, the price of wool went up and down. You have drought. You have floods. You have depression, which occurred in the 19th century in Australia over and over again. And so the landowners couldn't give much, and ordinary people couldn't give much. And so one of the things Tyrrell had to do was to try and change the attitude of giving. And he did that by emphasising the importance of local giving. He asked established churches to support new churches, which was good thinking. And to try to get people to give, he would go on about it quite a lot. He'd give a clear explanation, gentle persuasion, and he was apparently very good at that. And then consistent firmness. He would visit, he would write to you, and then he would visit again. And whilst that was extremely tiring, the approach worked because when he went to see you, you could ask him questions, he could answer those questions, and he could explain exactly what your problems were and the answers to them. And he used his own money. He was reasonably well off from a family inheritance. He used his own money to support the diocese, and when he died, he left everything he had to the diocese. A problem with clergy. He wanted to build a college, but that was not viable. Education standards were a problem, but he did start to have apprentices. In 1849 he had 6 apprentices, only 4 of them completed it. In 1853 he had 2 apprentices, then in 1854, 6, 7 and 9 he had 1 in each year. So it's not a lot of people, and it's a lot of work for the bishop to take the time to teach these people not only ministry but theology, the Bible, church history, all the other stuff. Some came from the United Kingdom, but not large numbers, and a lot of them were not really suitable. If you were English, you thought in terms of the parish. If you came to Newcastle, you were a missionary, because you didn't have a parish. You had an area that was called your parish, but you had to actually go out and work amongst the people. And often those who came were people who couldn't make it in England. Misfits who thought would be big people. So many were unsuitable. Also cost a lot of money. He paid £100 for a single person to come out and £150 for a couple to come out, for a married clergyman to come out. Then he had to find £200 a year as a stipend, which went up to £300 after a year or two. And then he had to offer, you can serve for 5 years, and if you want to return to England, you can. So it was money thrown away. And when they came, they stayed at Bishop's Court until accommodation was found for them. So, I mean, it's incredible. But he still couldn't get enough. And remember, he also had to provide school teachers, because virtually every church would have a school attached to it, and you had to have school teachers to do that. Buildings were a problem. A lot of them were temporary because population kept moving. So you didn't want to build a beautiful big stone edifice and then have all the population move. So temporary building. You had to build not only churches, you had to build schools and clergy residences. So it's a huge task. And he was a traveller. Boy, was he a traveller. These days, a horse can do 25 to 35 miles a day, 40 to 60 kilometres. I looked it up. In the 19th century, a horse could do maybe 50 miles in a day. So see, we're not the only ones that have got weak. Horses have got weaker too. But you can only do that for a day or two before you've got to have a pretty substantial rest. So a horse does 5 to 10 miles per hour. It can't keep it up all day. There were huge distances. Many places the roads were non-existent, and the roads that were there were rough. And he stopped along the way to talk to all the landowners. Everywhere he went, he would stop to talk to the landowners. First of all, as a pastor, but secondly, how about some money to support a local ministry? Really incredible stuff. Now, I don't think we understand what's involved here, so I won't go the wrong way. No. There it is, here we go. Newcastle Cathedral to Morpeth, right? 28 to 32 kilometres. It takes 3 to 4 hours on horseback. About 7 hours to walk, which is what he had to do when he missed the boat. Newcastle to Raymond Terrace, 2 to 3 hours. Newcastle to Maitland, 3 to 4 hours. Newcastle to Singleton, 7 to 9 hours. This is on horseback. This is if you just want to visit, you know. Muswellbrook, 12 to 14 hours. Scone, 15 to 17 hours. So you want to go to Scone, you're taking 2 days. Gosford, 8 to 10 hours. Tamworth, more than 30 hours. Port Macquarie, more than 28 hours. Brisbane, at least 100 hours probably. And that's without stopping talking to people on the way. That's going every day. I'm just the average pace of a horse. If you just went all day, every day, that's what it would take. And Gosford to Wyong, that really was for the next lecture, but we won't go to there, was 2 to 3 hours. So the rector of Gosford, when he came to Wyong to take church, took him 2 to 3 hours to ride here. Well, we forget that sort of thing, but that's incredible. And Brisbane, 100 hours direct. He went there every 2 years. Via Tamworth, talking to people along the way. Go back. Okay, we're going through all those one by one. Okay, so distances, travel. The railway was of no use at all. It went from Honeysuckle Point to East Maitland in 1857, extended to Newcastle in 1858, and then of course the government decided we didn't need it in Newcastle in 2000 or whatever it was, and we cut it back to beyond Honeysuckle Point. And then it went to Singleton in 1863. It wasn't until the 1880s that they crossed to Hawkesbury. And so the railway's really out of much use. The bishop's journey in a year involved riding between 200 and 1,500 miles. Now, I sat down and tried to work it out from his diary. That's a very conservative estimate. Many years he did a lot more than 1,500 miles. He kept a very, very good diary, and just reading through bits of it, there's no way those figures are accurate, but they're the figures that I think Elton quotes. Okay, so growth. Within 5 years, the 17 parishes had become 22 parishes. Gold was found at Uralla in the early 1850s. Now, he didn't have the problems that Sydney had. When gold was found at Bathurst, that sort of blew everything. When gold was found in Ballarat, it blew everything for Melbourne Diocese. Uralla was never big, and so he didn't have to worry too much about that. Within 11 years, those 22 parishes become 32 parishes, with 5 of them in Queensland. And he boasted no college or cathedral, but every parish free of debt. His attitude was, I don't want a cathedral, I'm happy with the church that's there, the slab building that's there, because the church's mission is out in the parish. Very interesting in the light of modern theology in this diocese, where the bishop is everything. Tyrrell's view was the clergyman in the local area is the one that matters, and he has to be able to work free of debt without worrying about a big cathedral. And to have them free of debt, that's actually quite an incredible thing. In 1851 he began the Newcastle Church Society. It was responsible for schools, Bibles, churches, ministers and missionaries. It was made up of the bishop, the clergy, and all Anglicans who contributed £10 were members, and all Anglicans who contributed 10 shillings were entitled to vote. It was the forerunner of synod. So far before his time, it's ridiculous. He took the attitude way, way back in 1851, I cannot run this diocese on my own, I need to involve the clergy and the laity in a democratic process. They lasted 16 years and did a very effective job. They began, for example, a book depot at Morpeth in 1853, providing to the parishes Bibles, Testaments, prayer books, Sunday school prizes, other general books and tracts. And in 1868, Synod took over the work of the Newcastle Church Society. Again, can I just say, the man was so far ahead of his time, it's not funny. The diocese then was subdivided. In 1860, Brisbane, in 1862, Grafton and Armidale, and the idea was the bishop would spend summer in Armidale and winter in Grafton because winter in Armidale was too cold. Now again, he set it up brilliantly. He set it up saying Grafton and Armidale cannot exist together forever. And so he set it up so it was easy to divide it into the parish of Grafton, the Diocese of Grafton, the Diocese of Armidale. And he got that written into the Constitution so it would be easy to divide, ahead of his time. Can I say, it took them 5 years to find a bishop for Grafton and Armidale. And after 5 years he arrived. 2 days later he and his son drowned.
Oh.
And it took another 2 years to find another bishop. Now again, when the other bishop came, Tyrrell rode on his horse to Armidale, and the bishop and his wife followed in a horse and cart, which is much slower. He arrived in one of the worst snowstorms Armidale had ever experienced, so nobody came to his induction. But when he got to Uralla, out of the snow came a man on a horse. And it was William Tyrrell, who despite the weather had ridden from Armidale to Uralla to welcome the bishop and accompany him into his new area. What can I say? Education, I could go on for an hour on education, what he did in that. I'm not going to even talk about it other than to say he was brilliant. He got schools going, and whenever he visited a parish, he always stopped in at the school, talked to the children, talked to the teachers, checked on how things were going, checked on the syllabus, all that sort of thing. He did a brilliant job in educating the children of the diocese. And I could have gone on for another hour on all the good things he did, but I won't. Aborigines. His plans for Aborigines didn't take effect because he didn't get support and he didn't have staff. But he did put up what needed to happen. I'm going to put it up there in a minute, because I want you to look at them carefully and realise that we are talking about the 1850s, and these things are still not being done, and yet they really are brilliant. The first thing was, people wander, so teachers have to wander with their pupils. Don't build a school for Aborigines. They're going to move around, so the teachers go with them. And then don't just teach the children, you've got to teach the adults as well, because if you only teach the children, when school is over, they go back to all their traditional ways. And you've undone everything you've done. So you need to teach the children, need to teach the adults as well as the children. And then because of the dialect problems between the different tribes, you'll never learn them. So when you get a convert amongst the Aborigines, you teach him to be a missionary because he can learn the dialects easier. And you let him be a missionary to his own people. This is the 1850s. Is that not way, way ahead of the time, including today, where we still complain schools with a large Aboriginal population, you only get 50% there on any given day? Tyrrell accepted that. He said, we'll go to them. Have I convinced you how great he was?
Absolutely.
And how great the diocese was, because it was well run. His clergy loved him, and he pastored them, and yet he did all that work. Now, it wasn't without opposition. Sunday sermons from Corinthians, do not go to the secular court. Okay. There's a newspaper article. You can't read it, but I'll tell you what it says. Tyrrell suspended the Reverend W.M. Thackeray, who was rector of West Maitland, for committing adultery. Thackeray took him to court for defamation. And that's the account of the church wardens being taken to court. Sorry, we're just talking about your sermon. Right. Okay, so the church wardens go to court. The bishop lost, because the court said adultery isn't that big an issue. You can't suspend somebody for adultery. So Tyrrell then said, right, I'm going to take his licence off him. If I can't suspend him, I'll sack him. So Thackeray took him back to court. And the bishop lost again, because the secular courts don't understand. Now, it's very interesting. Bishop Barker in Sydney, who was an evangelical, and they actually got on quite well together. Bishop Barker in Sydney suggested that he needed to take it to the Privy Council in England. But his health was shot, and it already cost £1,260. And so he said, no, I won't bother. And the other interesting thing is that Barker attacked the diocese for refusing to pay the costs for the bishop to take to this guy to court. He said, this is a big issue and the diocese should have been paid. So, after 31 years, the bishop died in the job. A broken man at the end, health-wise, simply because of his ministry. He was buried in Sandgate.
No.
Buried at Morpeth.
Absolutely, I've been there.
He was buried at Morpeth, and Bishop Batty was buried beside him because he was Batty's hero. So, thus ends 31 years of a bishop who made this a great diocese. And it really did rank as a great diocese, there's no question of that. Replaced by Josiah Pearson. The first problem with Pearson was, before they even started to think about him, can Newcastle afford a bishop? Because there's been a drought, a severe drought, and a lot of those landowners who had contributed towards the episcopal stipend, the bishop's money, were themselves debtors. That is, they'd lost all their money. And so it was very interesting. The Metropolitan, Bishop Barker, was not informed that Tyrrell had died for 3 months. Now Barker, of course, knew Tyrrell died. Barker went to visit him and everything else. But Barker said to them, no, don't officially tell me. You've got 3 months. And after 3 months, when they told him, he had 3 months before he had to do anything about it. So effectively, he said to the diocese, I'm going to give you 6 months to get your affairs in order. And that was good, because within 6 months they'd done it. They'd done it in less than that, and they had enough money to get a bishop. They met to elect a bishop, 28 clergy, 25 laymen, 2 candidates, and Pearson was elected and arrived in Sydney in 1880. The first bishop elected in Australia by a synod. Every other bishop had been appointed from England. This is the first time a synod had elected a bishop. Very, very significant. Who was he? He was a scholar. And that was important. It was a centenary of the settlement, 1888, and the idea of having a scholar was cultural, and that would be good. He was impressive. He'd impressed Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister. He was a friend of J.B. Lightfoot, the great New Testament scholar. He was a preacher, a writer, and in parish he worked amongst the poor. So it would seem he had everything. He was a clear speaker, and he was friendly. Exactly what Newcastle Diocese needed. So, he came. He brought fresh ideas. He encouraged fellowship between the churches. Now, Tyrrell had tried to do that too, but Pearson made that a big issue. Parishes getting on with each other. He supported sound religious education. He was very supportive of the Education Act, the Public Instruction Act, which Barker had sort of forced the scripture in schools and so on a bit. His idea was to uphold the faith, but he also wanted a cathedral, and so he wanted to build a cathedral. The 1880s were a very difficult period. There was drought, and there were many times there were difficulties paying the bishop. And as I mentioned before, stipends from the government virtually had gone by this stage. No clergy left who were receiving money from the government. And the city was expanding rapidly. There were 6 new municipalities. Now, they were all small. They all got their town halls. You go to Islington, there's a town hall. Waratah, there's a town hall. Wickham, there's a town hall. But the point was, all of those municipalities thought they ought to have a church. And so there was a growth in parishes. Hamilton, which although it had been an original settlement from the Australian Agricultural Company, got a church in 1885 from memory. With Hanbury was Waratah. Lambton, Belmont and Stockton. Churches in Wingham, Gresford, Gundy I didn't know anything about, but John tells me it's in Stroud Parish. Scone Parish. Yeah. Bulladela, which didn't last very long, had to be revived later, and Mount Vincent. And many weatherboard churches were being built. And in 1883, the foundations for the cathedral began. The foundations were finished in 2 years, cost £5,000. Nothing else was done for 6 years. Then by 1902 it was half built, and the walls of the nave were actually roofed, and then it was stopped again for 8 years, but that was used for church. In 1881, under Pearson, there was an ordinance created that made it a parish church as well. That makes it unusual for a cathedral. A cathedral is not usually a parish church. It meant it had a dean and a chapter, but it also had diocesan and parochial wardens. And and had a parish council, and the bishop, however, had use of it whenever he wanted because it was a cathedral. Okay. He probably did as much as he could, given the financial problems, the lack of clergy and the rapid development of the region. His churchmanship, comprehensiveness, happy to work with anybody, fitness of things had to be done properly, and he wanted unity, not uniformity. Happy for you to do your own thing, as long as you joined in with everybody else. He only lasted 6 years, when he was given a leave of absence for health reasons to go to England. He deteriorated rapidly mentally, and he was actually not able to resign until 1889. Now the point was they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't get another bishop or anything like that. He wasn't fit enough mentally to actually offer a resignation until 1889. He did get better, and he lasted till 1895, which is not bad, but we'll see there's a theme runs through the Diocese of Newcastle. Bishops leave in ill health and then last for another 20 or 30 years, because once they get out of Newcastle they get better. So there is a period of administration, and we'll start that next lecture. We've got to stop.
So,
1887 to 1991, Canon A.E. Selwyn. It was a time to stockdate and consolidate, and of course as the administrator he couldn't make changes. Finances were in a poor state, but even despite that, 4 new parishes were formed and 1 provisional district. New clergymen did come from England. New churches were built. Brick churches at Patterson, Jerry's Plain, Stockton and Merriweather, and then wooden churches, 2 in the Wingham parish, and then a whole lot of others. 3 church school halls were built, 2 parsonages. But even though he was administrator in the diocese, and a big diocese still, he got involved in the divorce bills that were going through the New South Wales Parliament. And then at the end, he called synod, and there was a 2/3 majority for George Henry Stanton, Bishop of Newcastle from 1890 to 1905. You can probably see what's going to happen here as well, can't you? He was an Englishman, trained at Oxford, served in both rural and city parishes in England, which is good. In 1878, he came to Australia to become the Bishop of North Queensland. Now, in that period, he travelled widely. In that period, he brought 50 clergymen from England, which is pretty incredible. They weren't always the best, but never mind. He began synodical government in the diocese, and he was described by his clergy as lovable, enthusiastic, energetic, and unselfish. Now, the reason he could bring clergy was he had a remarkable ability to know his clergy, their families, their key parishioners. He kept a diary. It's a fascinating diary. It's full of notes. So he could turn up in a parish and say to the rector, "Hello, Jim, how's Mary? How's Henry, your son? How's Rufus, your dog? How's Mrs. So-and-so?" Incredible. And that makes a big impression. I remember at Mount Druitt when the rector was in hospital and I was running the place, and Don Robinson was Bishop of Parramatta, and he said, "Oh, I'm free this Sunday, I'll come and preach for you." He came to the branch, he said, "No, I'll go to the branch church." And I met him there before I went up to the main church. And he got out of the car and he said to me, "What's the name of the organist?" I said, "That's Cobby." and the Irishman who's the Sunday school superintendent. I said, Herbie, yeah, right. And of course he went in and, hello Herbie, hello Cobby. But I thought, how impressive that is. I mean, there's no way he could remember them. But he made the effort to find out so he could go and be personal with them. Well, Stanton did remember them because he had his diary. Dog's name was such and such. When he came to Newcastle, there were financial difficulties, a rapidly growing and expanding population. The episcopate was plagued by droughts, floods and depression. So we go back, he was bishop from 1890 to 1905. All right, so 15 years full of problems. By the way, he was the only, or the most, no, until recently, the only evangelical bishop. He wasn't a strong evangelical, but he was evangelical. During his time, the number of parishes did not increase, but he reorganised them, he increased provisional districts, and he developed branch churches. He took the view that parishes had developed too quickly and there'd been mistakes made. And so he consolidated them so you had a parish related to the population. But instead of having a new parish at this town, he made it a branch church of that place. Now, that had all sorts of advantages, because it meant when you're short of clergy, the rector's got that relationship, that responsibility. You don't have to keep providing new rectors, you have to keep providing new houses. But then if you do have an excess of clergy, you can put a curate in there, you can put a young guy who's still learning the ropes in there as an assistant. And so branch churches become a big thing in the diocese. I'll mention branch churches at the end. Now, state aid had gone. He needed £1,600 each year to replace it. So he began a system of his assessments. And the assessments were designed to help new parishes. Tyrrell had done it by manipulation. You people need to help these new parishes. He did it by ordinance. It's an assessment you have to pay, and we'll use it for that. But also, not only do you have to pay, he also started the church aid fund in each parish, which was designed to raise money voluntarily to assist new parishes. So it got it both ways. But that's very good, because you see, if you raise money to assist a new parish, you then take an interest in that new parish. And so he's developing it. Very, very clever. He began a clergy superannuation fund in his first synod. That's way ahead of its time. Now, let me tell you, when you retired, your superannuation was not worth knowing about. But at least there was superannuation. And other places like Sydney were much later. In Sydney, Howard Mole, when he was Archbishop, faced this incredible problem of all these clergy who were old, but they'd never been paid very much, and they'd always had a house, so they had nowhere to retire to. So they stayed there till they died, and they were annoying because they were old and doddery and everything else. And he started Mole Village. So there was a place clergy could go, and if you're a clergyman, you can get in there cheaply, because it was a place for clergy to go when they wanted to quit ministry and they wanted to retire. I don't care how cheap it is, there's no way I'm going to live there. But anyway, that's where he started. Stanton, however, started a superannuation fund. He did further work in improving the cathedral, because he thought that was important. And the most important thing he did, probably, he appointed John Francis Stretch as Dean of the Cathedral. Now, Stretch was the coadjutor bishop or the assistant bishop in Brisbane. But Brisbane ran into financial difficulties and they couldn't afford him. And so Stanton grabbed him and made him dean of the cathedral. He wanted a building, this is Stanton, a building suitable for the city Newcastle was going to become. And if you look at the cathedral, you watch the NBN News, and behind them they've got the cathedral up there in that hill. It's pretty impressive, and that was his vision. Probably a waste of bricks, but still it's impressive. He was a good administrator who explained his decisions clearly, but the most important thing was he took his clergy with him. That was really important. 1905 Synod, he sent his address for somebody else to read because he was too sick to attend, and he died shortly after. Your lifespan, if you're a bishop of Newcastle, is not great. Well, what they did, they employed John Francis Stretch, the dean, as their new bishop. I couldn't find it. This is the day of photography. I couldn't find a photograph of him. All I could find was a line drawing. He's the first Australian to become a bishop. He's born in Geelong, trained at Trinity College, Melbourne, got a law degree, served in Melbourne parishes when he became Dean of Ballarat, and he became the Assistant Bishop of Brisbane, first Australian to become a bishop, and then of course Dean of the Newcastle Cathedral. He was a clear thinker, a successful pastor, he was practical, and he brought a fresh outlook to the diocese. The clergy loved the fact that he was practical. He saw problems and he dealt with them. The diocese expanded during his episcopate, and that's basically what he was known for. He expanded quite well. But although he was bishop from 1906 to 1919, the latter years were not very good. His wife died in 1915, and he himself never recovered from that. His son died in the war, and as a result of all that, his health deteriorated. He announced his retirement in January 1919 and died of a stroke in April. But it was a successful period. The diocese did expand. Then came Reginald Stephen, 1919 to 1928. Also born in Geelong, trained at Trinity College, Melbourne, and a curate and rector before he started the school of Trinity College in Melbourne. And then he became the warden of St John's Theological College in Melbourne from 1906 to 1914. He was also rector of Brighton and Dean of Melbourne during this time. Now, I remember I said last week, and we'll talk a bit more about this when we do Theological College in a minute, you had Moore College, which was evangelical, so it was unacceptable to a lot of people in the church. You had Trinity College in Melbourne, but it was part of the University of Melbourne, so you had to actually be able to go to university to go to Trinity College, and most men training for the ministry couldn't get to university. So Ridley College in Melbourne started for that reason, but Ridley was also evangelical. So in Melbourne, where there was a tradition of Anglo-Catholic, evangelical and everybody in between, all living happily together, St John's Theological College started as a sort of middle-of-the-road theological college for people who were not university graduates. He was made Bishop of Tasmania and then became Bishop of Newcastle. The synod that elected him, 50 clergy, 46 laity, you can see how much things have grown. There were 3 candidates, First two candidates, the clergy and laity couldn't agree on, but Stephen, they all agreed on. He was a scholar of Hebrew and Greek and of political economy, which is an interesting subject. It's politics, but it's also economics, history and all that rolled into one. He strongly believed that Christianity included a social gospel. He wasn't a Marxist like some others were, like Bergman was, for example, who was here. But he was really interested in ministering to the workers, Newcastle being an industrial and mining diocese, so you had a lot of workers, poorly educated usually and poor, unemployed, unions. He favoured the unions because it was democracy, and he believed very strongly in democracy. And he was a strong supporter of the White Australia policy. He believed it was important to have social structure in society, and our society was Anglo-Saxon, so you needed to keep it that way. Now, I mentioned last week the whole idea of assimilation, which I still think was the right policy, but the White Australia policy is another issue, but he was a strong supporter of it. He retired to Melbourne in ill health in 1928, and he died in 1956. Right? Get out of Newcastle, you recover. That's the
Couldn't have been
principle.
too ill.
Get out of Newcastle, you get better. Okay, so a couple of other things. He handled the post-war challenges really well. Australian society after the war changed dramatically. And the Hunter Valley changed dramatically. And you still have, for example, I know as we come out of Cessnock, there are the soldier settlements there, which were a dismal failure in most places, because the idea was, a very good idea, you get these poor soldiers who come back, you give them some land. The fact that they've never been on a farm in their life and haven't got a clue how to use it doesn't matter, but anyway. But he handled all of that really well, and he got around him really excellent assistants, and that was important. And the major coup of his time, he removed St John's Theological College from Armidale to Newcastle, and I'll talk about that after I do the next bishop. He established 2 grammar schools. The biggest weakness was that he actually, although he believed the church had to work amongst the working class, he himself couldn't. Ken Cable says he lacked the common touch. And then again, Ken Cable says in 1928 he resigned from ill health officially, but Ken Cable says, quote, he had had enough. It'll do that to you, this diocese. And 28 years in retirement. George Merrick Long became the next bishop. He was also born in Victoria, went to Queensland very young and was educated up there, then went to Trinity College, Melbourne, and became a curate in Melbourne, founded Trinity Grammar School in Melbourne, became its principal. In 1911 became Bishop of Bathurst. In World War I he joined the AIF, the Australian Infantry Forces, and he was made director of what was called the Education Project. He was made a Lieutenant Colonel, and he set up such a successful education program for the troops that in England he was awarded a CBE, and he was given an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from Cambridge University. So, pretty impressive stuff. In 1911 he became Bishop of Bathurst. And he went to the war, he came back to Bathurst, he started schools. He was also an advocate of the White Australia policy. He was elected Bishop of Newcastle in 1928. In 1930 he went to the Lambeth Conference with all the other bishops, had a cerebral hemorrhage and died. So we can't tell you much more about him. Should talk to you about St John's Theological College. The desire, of course, was for an educated clergy. In England, the old idea of apprenticeship to the bishop had long gone by the board. You had theological colleges established, and they wanted that in Australia. So Bishop Arthur Green of Grafton and Armidale set up the Poor Man's College in 1898. Poor Man's College, the idea was you didn't have to have a university degree, you didn't have to be all that well educated, and you didn't have to be evangelical, which is what you had to be at Moore and Ridley. Even today, a lot of clergy don't have proper theological qualifications. But anyway, the college was part funded by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The college building The college building is at the top, designed by Aubrey Hunt, who designed the cathedral. It's now part of the New England Girls' School. The building at the bottom is when it moved to Morpeth. Bishop Green was the warden and did all the lecturing. He had 5 students. Might as well have had an apprenticeship system. But he quickly added 3 new wardens, or three more wardens followed, and they added new buildings until 1918. And in 1918, the rector of Wyong was sent to Armidale as the warden of St John's College. Ernest Baldwin, a very significant figure in church history, as the Bishop of Goulburn, or later Canberra Goulburn. He was an Australian born in Taree, educated at Sydney University. He was known as an inspiring director of ordinance, a witty teacher and a wide-ranging thinker. Now, it depends on who you read. If you read Elkin, the bishop was the one who moved the college from Armidale to Morpeth. If you read Cable, Bergman was the one who wanted it in Morpeth and moved it there because he thought it was better being in a bigger centre. Probably never know exactly, they probably worked together. But he transformed the college once it was moved. He appointed a vice principal, and he set out to provide not just a theological education but a national view. He tried to make it more intellectual. They founded at the college a thing called the Morpeth Review. His vice principal, he and his vice principal and A.P. Elkin, who wrote the history, were the editors. And the idea was it was for people who were on the border of institutional religion. So it contained economics, anthropology, religion, current affairs, but all from a sort of Christian perspective. It didn't last. When he was appointed Bishop of Goulburn in 1934, it ceased. The college was built on the site that had been given to the church by Close. It's actually 2,600 acres that he gave, and they used Closebourne House and built other buildings. It had a series of wardens and a series of principals, probably not worth going through them, not many of them were distinguished. It had a number of distinguished graduates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 bishops, not counting Sonia, who is our current assistant bishop. It trained the Alf Clint, who started the Tranby Aboriginal College, and of course it trained a number of the clergy who were named in the children's royal abuse thing. It was called Satan's Playground. In fact, according to the Royal Commission, 45 alleged abusers were trained at St John's College, more than any other institution. The criticism that the Royal Abuse Commission made of it was that it was a screening process that was at fault. They would take all sorts of people without proper screening, and that's how people got in and got through. Been corrected since. Francis DeWitt Batty, 1879 to 1961. He only lasted three years after he left Newcastle. That's all right. Bishop of Newcastle, 1931 to 1958. All problems of philosophy, politics and economics become ultimately questions of theology. Very important. He saw everything in terms of the Christian faith. His theology, of course, wasn't the same as some of us would have. The most important act he did in all those years as Bishop of Newcastle was to confirm me, I suppose. That's a bit egotistical, isn't it? But as a young kid who wasn't really interested, I do remember he was an old man because it was at the end of his episcopate. But he had some sort of aura about him. You sensed he was special. I remember that, and I remember over food, because that's all that we really went for, listening to people talk, thinking, people really love him.
It confirmed me too. It confirmed me too.
Yeah. So there's my recollections as a kid, knowing nothing about him. He's an Englishman, trained at Oxford and then Wells Theological College, so he actually had some proper theological education. He was a curate, and his rector was appointed to Brisbane, and he came as his chaplain, and then became Dean of Brisbane, and then coadjutor Bishop of Brisbane, until the 1930 Synod, when 76 clergy and 100 laity. 2 candidates failed to get support. One of those candidates was Bergman, and so the Diocesan Council was asked to make the appointment. They decided that if the 2 candidates couldn't get support, then they'd ignore them. They invited Neville Talbot, who was Bishop of Pretoria in Africa, who declined. They invited Batty, and he accepted. One of the things that was very noted about him was that this was the early days of radio, and he was a brilliant radio performer. He was good in print, he wrote good stuff in newspapers and so on, but apparently he was superb on radio. He began with the depression as his big issue. I fancy becoming a bishop and having the depression hit. He was known for being very critical of government and business at times, and being therefore very unpopular with a lot of people. He was a strong supporter of democracy. He attacked the welfare state. He said that the welfare state is not the kingdom of God. The church needs to be the provider. The church needs to work for reform, but it needs to look after people, not let the government do it. He saw unemployment, local unemployment was huge in the Hunter Valley, and he saw the local church as the place to deal with it. Not the government, not the diocese, the local rector. He's the one who's got to solve it. And for that he was given support from the bishop. He spoke very strongly against Sovietism, against Russia, against fascism and against Nazism. He believed in the worth of the individual, in individual freedom, and he kept relating the issues to theology. So in the pre-war years, he was very antagonistic to Germany and to the build-up to war, which a lot of others weren't, including Bergman, I have to say. And then post-war, the diocese faced huge problems. Every problem he looked at in terms of theology. How does Christianity solve it? Christianity is practical, and there should be no issue that Christianity can't solve. That was his view. a big interest in the Constitution for the Australian Church. It was actually very important. In the diocese, he reduced the reliance on the endowment by giving greater responsibilities to parishes, which worked well for the rich parishes, didn't do too well for the poorer parishes. He was not good with the miners, the mining villages, because again, like his predecessor, he lacked the common touch. In the 1950s, he travelled overseas a lot, left the diocese to his assistant, and the diocese probably could have done with a bit more of him here. That's not from Elkin. Elkin was a fan. That's from Cable. He retired at 80 and died not long afterwards. He disliked extremism in churchmanship. So, for example, he supported the Bishop of Bathurst in the Red Book case. The Red Book case was the Bishop of Bathurst was taken to court for using the Red Book, which was effectively the 1928 Prayer Book, which was illegal. Now, he supported him not because he wanted to see that happen, but because he didn't want to see division in the secular courts over ritualism. Again, moderate. Died in 1961. James Houston became bishop in 1958. He was born in England, in Birmingham, but he was educated in Queensland, at the University of Queensland. He worked in a variety of parishes and missions, became rector of Darwin, then had churches in Brisbane, Melbourne, and then became Bishop of Rockhampton in 1947, in 1958 Bishop of Newcastle. He retired in poor health in 1972, and you'll notice he didn't die till 1994. Is there not a common theme here? Yes. Now, in the Royal Commission, he was accused of being a pedophile, a supporter of pedophiles. Not a great deal was said about it, but he had a clergyman who was accused of molesting children, and he did remove him, he sacked him. But that clergyman then was given a position in Grafton Diocese, and Houston actually wrote to him and said, "I'm really glad that the Bishop of Grafton has seen fit to give you a job. I hope you will take this as an opportunity to use it properly." The guy didn't. He was appointed to Lismore, where there was a children's home and a lot of children suffered as a result. Now, I think that's fairly minor. I mean, he did actually remove him from the diocese. He just didn't remove him from holy orders, which was a big step. And in his letter, he did tell him he hoped he reformed. But I'm not going to condemn him for that. Then we come to 1973, and from 1973 to the present time, everything is overshadowed by the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. The child abuse activities themselves and the cover-ups. But good things did happen, and bishops did make some positive changes, and churches did get things done. Most of that will be forgotten because of this show. So Ian Shevell was appointed Bishop of Newcastle. He was bishop from 1973 to 1977, when he retired in ill health and lived until 1988. He had a stroke, a very debilitating stroke, but he retired and continued to write and do all sorts of other things. Educated at Scots College in Sydney, at Sydney University, and at Moore College. At Moore College. Now, there is the story of Ian Shevell writing a doctrine essay and getting it back and getting 10 out of 10. And T.C. Hammond had scrawled on it, "You're 100% wrong, but you've argued very well." He was one of those that T.C. Hammond didn't manage to convert to the evangelical way. He was a really good academic and a progressive thinker, although he did some weird things I'll tell you about in a minute. He worked for the ABM, for the Australian Board of Missions, and was consecrated Bishop of North Queensland in 1953 at the age of 34, the youngest bishop in the Anglican Communion, known forevermore as the Boy Bishop. Now, because his reputation has been shot, let me tell you, he was in North Queensland for 17 years. The diocese was bankrupt and short of clergy when he began. The number of clergy doubled in his time. He built 16 new churches, formed 6 new parishes, which is not a bad effort. His wife died in 1970. He went to England, was bishop in London for a while, came to Newcastle in 1973, remarried in 1974. The big thing about him was he appointed professional administrators and fundraisers. He got the right people around him. That's the key thing. He was an academic, but he knew he wasn't an administrator or a fundraiser, so he got the right people. He began an appeal, he reorganised the diocese, he began an appeal to complete the cathedral. He established a cathedral close. Now, it's an English idea. The idea is that around the cathedral you have housing for the dean and the bishop and all the others, and so they can work together and live together, which probably is a good idea until you realise who the dean was. You realise it actually become a bad idea. But it was just based on the English pattern. And he improved St John's Morpeth, although some would question how much he improved it. But because he was an academic, he was interested in that. He retired in 1977 to Brisbane, where he wrote 2 autobiographies and a whole lot of other books. He was an Anglo-Catholic. He attacked the Wowser Puritanism of the Church, that's the evangelicals, but he actually rejected permissiveness. He was controversial. When he was in North Queensland, he supported what was called racial conversion theology. Aborigines are inferior, they need to be civilised, and the aim is to transform pagan natives into compliant Christian citizens. You see why Tyrrell sounds so good? Yeah, anyway. But of course the biggest blight on his memory is the Child Abuse Royal Commission, where he was named by the Commission as an abuser. Bishop Greg Thompson said that he was abused by him at the age of 19. The Royal Commission accepted that as true. Now, no other victims have ever come forward, and a lot of people refused to accept it, but the Royal Commission had no doubt that it was true. And they had the benefit, of course, of things that we don't have the benefit of interviewing Bishop Thompson, of reading all of the stuff and so on. To be fair to him, the director of East Maitland, Canon Marshall, abused 2 girls. It was reported to Cheval, and Cheval said, "I will fix it. Keep it quiet for the good name of the church." And that's the cover-up bit. But by the end of the year, Canon Marshall had retired. Now, I don't think he retired of his own free will. I think that's the bishop's effort, because the bishop then had a stroke, and Canon Marshall withdrew his retirement and continued. So I think Cheval's problem there was he did actually act and say go, but retire so you don't lose, it's not a controversy. Did nothing official about it, so when he wasn't there, Marshall was able to keep going. The wrong thing to do, obviously, but and then it starts to deteriorate. Al Holland, and the only picture I could find of him was of him at the Royal Commission. He was an Englishman. He was the Assistant Bishop of Perth when he was invited to Newcastle. He was chairman of the Liturgical Commission. He was an activist. He led a moratorium against the Vietnam War. When he came to Newcastle, he raised money for the completion of the cathedral, and it was completed in his time. He established the Samaritans. Okay, very important. He was a strong activist on unemployment and the lack of public housing in Newcastle. In fact, they reckoned that Neville Wran hated him because he kept writing and complaining to Neville Wran about unemployment and the lack of public housing in Newcastle. He really did try to get things done. He created new parishes. Now, this is a time when the church is still doing all right, but it's in decline. He created new parishes. He established specialist chaplaincies. That was new. That was different. He improved clergy stipends and superannuation. Very important. After the earthquake, he had a big role in bringing the city together and doing lots of rebuilding and that sort of thing. He was a strong supporter of, he started a decade of evangelism in 1990. Don't ask me what he thought evangelism was, but that was it. I should need to do some reading on that. A strong supporter of women's ordination, the first, Newcastle being the first to ordain a woman to the priesthood. The thing that doesn't appear in the documents is he attempted to remove evangelicals and to transform evangelical parishes. And that was a deliberate move. So, for example, the strongest evangelical parish in Newcastle was Merriweather, and he turned that into an Anglo-Catholic parish. Merriweather now has a Sydney Evangelical as its rector, and he struggled at the beginning with parishioners who just didn't want to make the changes. But it had been the most evangelical parish in the diocese, probably. Did the same thing at Kincumber, where the congregation left. And the clergyman that he appointed, facing no congregation and everything else, had a nervous breakdown. I remember his assistant, Richard Appleby. We were at a conference in Melbourne. I was the speaker and he was one of the attendees. We were sitting having coffee on the veranda at one stage, just the two of us, and he said, look, the worst thing that my boss is doing is getting rid of evangelicals. He said, just like Sydney couldn't afford to get rid of the high church parishes, and there were a few and they're allowed to exist, he said, we shouldn't be getting rid of evangelicals. He said, you've got to have churches that the disaffected can go to. And then in a moment of honesty he said, and that's also where most of the money is. So he was well aware of what was happening. Holland's legacy will always be tainted by the Royal Commission, where he regularly answered, I do not remember. And a lawyer said of his approach, Bishop Holland had a do-nothing approach to matters of sexual impropriety. Ably assisted by his assistant Bishop Richard Appleby from 1983 to 1992, who of course was defrocked for his part in the cover-up. Holland died before any good thing could be done. Now I'll make the rest of it very, very brief because these guys are still around. Roger Herft was a Sri Lankan Bishop of Waikato in New Zealand, Bishop of Newcastle 93 to 2005, and Bishop of Perth, Archbishop of Perth, removed from Holy Orders in 2022. And Brian Farron, who still lives in the diocese, educated at the Australian National University and St John's Morpeth, which is important, served in Canberra, Rockhampton, Assistant Bishop of Perth, and then came to Newcastle. And then finally Bishop Greg Thompson, who was Bishop from 2013 to 2017, born in Muswellbrook, educated at Newcastle University and Ridley College, so our second evangelical bishop. Worked in Darlinghurst, was the BCA Secretary in New South Wales, Darwin and Canberra. Bishop of the Northern Territory from 2007 to 2013. Very, very sad, I think. I got my licence just as he arrived. You know, I had problems getting it because Peter Stewart didn't want to give it to me. So my licence came through after Bishop Thompson had been consecrated, and he refused to post it. He said, you have to come and see me to get it. And the half-hour interview went for an hour and a half. Now I came out of that shaking my head saying, this guy will transform the diocese, except I bet no one let him do it. Now, I can't tell you all of that discussion because a lot of it was private, but there are three things I can tell you that were very significant. He saw that he had a number of problems, but he had three major problems. The first was the training of clergy. He said, all of my clergy are being trained in Melbourne. I have no input into what they learn, and I have no say in who gets trained. And people turn up on my doorstep and say, here's my theology degree, ordain me. And that was really unsatisfactory. And that's why we now have a director of formation who is supposed to do all of that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The second problem, he said, was my clergy have never used the preble. By that he meant 1662. They're all using the second order, which is not really the preble. And he said, I want to have a conference for my clergy to teach them preble. And he said, will you lecture at it? Yeah. And the third one was, he said, my fellow evangelicals don't support me. He said, the church plants, for example, at Erina, he said, CMS run their conference there and they don't even have the courtesy to tell me that they're doing it. And he said, I really feel neglected by my fellow evangelicals. And I know that's sad because Peter Brain in Armidale felt exactly the same way. He felt that Sydney just refused to do the kind of things that a rural bishop needed. Anyway, he was the one that got all of the press at the Royal Commission. Of course, at the end of that, he was completely shattered and his career was over. Now, I want to talk about the Royal Commission because I don't think you can do the history of Newcastle Diocese without talking about it, and I want to just say a few things. There is a book, of course, The Crimes of the Cross, which, if you've got a strong stomach, you can read it. It sets it all out, and it's really terrifying what happened. Newcastle Diocese, Anglican Diocese, were worse than anybody else. That's a simple fact. There was a network of abusers who existed without control. There was no structure to deal with it. There was simple systems which just didn't work. The wrong people were involved. For example, if you were abused, the person to report to was the Dean, who himself was jailed as an abuser eventually. And the bishop, in each case, as we've seen, didn't act. The perpetrators, Dean Lawrence was jailed. Most of them died before justice occurred. The only thing that I'm happy about is that on the day of judgment, justice will be done. That's the bottom line. Now, why did the leadership fail? I actually want to spend some time on this because we are very critical of the bishops, and the Royal Commission was very critical of the bishops. But I think as a historian, I always say, empathy is important. You have to understand why they did what they did. They can never be absolved of blame because their inaction led to a number of people being seriously injured. But I think you have to understand the background. There was naivety, first of all. Clergy are good people. They couldn't do that. Now remember, most of these bishops were brought up, as I was, on a history where you talked about the positives, 100 great men and all that sort of thing, and you talked about the positives. Nowadays, we tear everybody to pieces. But the result was that you thought clergy were good, and you didn't look for things that were wrong. So when they were told things, no, they couldn't do that. And also you have to understand in this naivety, these people are very clever at covering themselves. And so somebody says to you, he's abusing kids, and you look at him and you say, but he's doing a damn good job in the parish. And so you don't accept it. I'll take the time, we'll go over time, sorry about that. I worked as a curate with another curate. He had been the Sydney Diocesan Youth Director. He'd been rector of a neighbouring parish for a very short time, and then he came to us as a curate. The story was he got fed up with the administration in the parish, and so he just wanted to be a curate and work amongst young people. Now, I don't know whether that was what he'd said, or whether that was the diocese covering up for removing him. He was an abuser of teenage girls. Now, in the 18 months we worked together, he was probably on his best behaviour. But I knew him really well. We spent a lot of time in each other's houses, and we even on one occasion at a house party decided on the Saturday night that on the Sunday we needed to talk to them about relationships, which included sex and everything else. And I still remember sitting on a hail bay in a shearing shed at Hill End, where it was freezing cold. And we did talk totally unprepared, bouncing off each other. And he did not say a single thing that wasn't standard biblical evangelical teaching. Not a single thing. And yet it was later uncovered he was a serial abuser of young girls, and I've met many of them and I know the damage that he caused to some of them. I never suspected a thing. Now, I'm naive. My wife was the one who saw through things. She couldn't believe it either. So he really did. And that's one of the problems. You know, these people get away with it because of that. The second thing is Christians are forgiving. And so the idea is that Christians can change, so they deserve a second chance. A chance to change. So you send them somewhere else to give them a second chance. And then they do it all over again. But it's the Christian way, isn't it? Somebody does something wrong, you say, well, you need to repent. You need to change. Now, I think probably these days we know that pedophiles don't change. But I'm not sure they knew that back then. Thirdly, there was a concern for reputation, the reputation of the church and the reputation of clergy. Better for people not to know these things, so these things mustn't become public, so you hushed it all up. Now, the reputation of the church has suffered more damage because of that. But at the time, I can see why they would think that. The next problem is mates, friends, colleagues. They were friends with these people. Farron, in his... Now, I watched most of the Royal Commission and I've read all of the papers and everything that went to it. Farron, in his submission to the Royal Commission, didn't come out in the Royal Commission, but his submission, says that he agonised over removing Graham Lawrence as Dean of the Newcastle Cathedral. Why? Because Lawrence was a friend, a mate. And he found it almost impossible, A, to accept it was true, and B, to do this to a mate. Now, that's the problem in a diocese where, you know, it's small and people are intertwined. The fear of backlash. Bishop Thompson, when he went to the cathedral, had everybody turn their back on him. Well, I had a lot of people turn their back on him because of what he'd done. You know, this Royal Commission stuff. They were judged by the good work in the parish. The idea was if a guy was doing a good job, you know, well, I don't know, do you want to really remove him from that? Now that's I think, goes hand in hand with an unawareness of the seriousness. You see, if the Bible is not the centre of everything you think, then you have no idea of how serious sin is. I mean, even evangelicals don't necessarily talk enough about sin. But I think these people actually didn't realise the seriousness of sin. And the attitude to homosexuality, Holland actually said in his submission, as long as they're doing a good job, it doesn't matter. And if they didn't understand that, you know, abuse of children carries right through life, then the idea is, well, you know, it's not that important. And I think that was there for a lot of them. And then there was fear. There'd been threats. There were legal threats, there were professional threats, there were personal threats. I mean, the guy that did most of the work, the layman that did most of the work, lost his dog, was killed. Cars were destroyed, all sorts of things. So, what I'm saying here is, you see, I'm not going to say the bishops shouldn't be blamed the way they were, but I am going to say we need to understand what was behind it and why they did what they did, and we can be a little bit more, I think, merciful towards them for that. Now, the other thing is, you need to understand in this period of time, it wasn't only the church. And a lot of it didn't come out in the Royal Commission. I was the school council president at a school in Sydney. Got a phone call one morning from the principal. Can I see you? Went up. Let's go and talk on the Oval because I don't want to be overheard anywhere. The 6th class teacher has abused some of the girls in his class. He came here, having been moved from another school for abusing girls. Nobody told me. If I'd have known, I would have actually supervised him far more carefully. Okay, what do? We report it. Simple as that. Fine, we did that. He was then put into regional office for 6 months on the typewriter. Got a call from the principal, come and see me. I went up, he said, he's been reappointed to and named a school in a nearby suburb. And he said, here's the problem. I've been told that if I tell the principal of that school, I will be dismissed because we're giving him a second chance. And he said, but there's nothing in the law about school council presidents, is there? So I rang the school council president of that school, told him the story. He told the principal. Within a couple of weeks he was out of the school. But you see, it wasn't just the church that was doing it. The education department was doing it over and over again. What was the cost? Well, the bishops, of course, lost a lot. Lost their reputations, and a number of them lost their holy orders. The reputation of the church was destroyed. And I don't know if we'll ever get it back, to tell you the truth. Finances were in a mess because we had to pay these people, and rightly so. But where does the money come from? Now, we are paying here in Wyong for the failure of those bishops. Remembering, of course, one of our clergy was involved as well. And then there are the current failures. I know that heterosexuals can be pedophiles as well. But in the case of the Diocese of Newcastle, every person named in the Royal Commission was a homosexual. Now, given that, the present push for the blessing of same-sex marriages and the present push for homosexuals and gender stuff by the bishop, I think is crazy. Now, even if you believe that, I would have thought you shut up about it publicly. Because every time it's mentioned, it must bring back in the minds of people, because it brings back in my mind that these are the people who are responsible for that. Now, even if you say, well, that's unfair on all homosexuals and all that sort of thing, I just wouldn't be putting it up front, given the way the reputation is. And of course, Bishop Greg Thompson, who was a man who had so much to give the diocese, has been lost. I think that's very sad, because I really loved him. So what about the diocese today? What do we stand for? Oh, who knows? Read the diocesan publications, you won't find the gospel anywhere. So if you're mad about climate change, and I use mad deliberately, there's no difference between the church and the Greens. If you're concerned about refugees, there's no difference between the church and the refugee organisations. We don't stand for anything. We need to stand for the gospel. And isn't it interesting that the only churches in the diocese that are doing well are the evangelical churches who stand for something, who stand firm on the Bible. A reputation is shot, I don't know that it can ever be rebuilt. The only way to rebuild it is for each parish to work in the community, to get out into the community and to show people that we are not like this. It's probably going to take a couple of generations to rebuild the reputation, but it won't be rebuilt by bishops or rectors. It'll be rebuilt by Christians working with other Christians, with non-Christians, to show that we're all right. Finances, it'll take a long time to repay what we owe. And that's not it when you close churches. Now the big issue is closing churches. We keep closing churches. Look at all the parishes we once had, and it's incredible. And the current move, you see, you may have 3 parishes with 4 churches. You put them together as one parish. Now there's 4 churches. You close one and sell it. Good income. And you close branch churches, because we've done that in the past. Every time you close a church, you lose people. We closed Yarramalong. We still take funerals. It took funerals for people from up there. True blue Anglicans never come here. But you know, families buried up there and all that sort of thing. If we'd have had a service up there, which we tried to get, but the council stopped it. If we'd have had a service up there, I would think we would have had a viable congregation up there, just from talking to people at funerals. We're closing churches. In Newcastle, I looked at the number of churches in Newcastle and the spread of churches. There are whole areas without a church. And that can't be good. I was confirmed at Waratah, took my first communion at Georgetown. Waratah closed. The Memorial Garden in Waratah, you know, all Fluker's ashes, that went to Georgetown. Now that's closed. Hey, what do you think of the church if your parents' ashes were put in the wall there and they closed the church and moved them, then they closed that church? These are issues that are important for non-church people. And the other thing with closing churches, of course, is people can't get to them. Oh, everybody's got a car. No, they don't. Kids can't get to things if their parents aren't Christians and drive them. Old people can't get there. I mean, I'm old enough to start thinking, what happens when I lose my licence, which may be possible because of arthritis in the neck. I can't get in. It's impossible. I'll become Seventh-day Adventist because it's just around the corner. And I mean, look, Adamstown, one of the early church, big church, in 2013, they relaid the floor with marble that came from Turkey and from Italy. I hate to think of what it costs. Okay, the rector got sacked 12 months ago, the bishop closed the church. He can't sell it at the moment, that's a problem. But Hamilton, big centre, beautiful church, only have service on Wednesday now.
Is that right?
Yep.
Hamilton?
Yep, Hamilton. No, anyway, clergy. Well, there's the problem of training, the problem of formation. You know, when Kevin Wares was taken from here to Newcastle to be the director of formation, great idea. We didn't want to lose him, but you know, an evangelical actually is formation. And you know, I had an experience of it. He got me to lecture to them on the prayer book, and it was like eyes were opened. We didn't know that. Oh, you know. And suddenly these people who weren't evangelicals are starting to think, hang on a minute, I've been led astray on a lot of this stuff. We need to actually get into the community and let them see that as Christians we are ordinary people. Let me stop there.